My name is Marisol Vidal. I am 29 years old, and I used to believe that being useful was the same thing as being loved. I was wrong. I grew up in a 4-bedroom colonial in Claremont, New Hampshire, the kind of house that looked generous from the street, with its white trim and the oak tree my grandfather planted in the front yard before I was born. Inside, the square footage was divided the way most things in our family were divided, according to who my father decided mattered most that season. For most of my childhood and all of my adult life, that person was not me. My father, Rodrigo Vidal, had built a mid-sized residential property management company over 30 years. Vidal Property Holdings managed 83 units across 3 counties, single-family rentals, a few small multi-unit buildings, one commercial strip that had been underperforming since 2019. He ran it with the confidence of a man who believed the company existed because of his instincts alone, and that instincts were genetic, and that the gene had passed to exactly one of his 2 daughters. That daughter was my sister, Pilar. Pilar was 34 and had worked in the company's front office since she was 22. She handled tenant communications and vendor relationships and attended every dinner party my parents threw for local real estate contacts. She wore blazers to Sunday lunches. She called my father the visionary without a trace of irony. My father called her the face of this family's future. I was the other daughter. What I actually did, what I had been doing for 6 years, was keep the company's finances from collapsing. I had a bachelor's degree in accounting from UNH and a CPA license I'd earned on the first sitting, which is not something most people do. I managed the books, the tax filings, the debt service schedules on 3 properties my father had financed at variable rates in 2021 when rates were still low. When those rates adjusted, I was the one who restructured the payment timelines, negotiated with 2 lenders directly, and kept 2 properties off a default notice. My father thanked the lenders. He did not thank me. I worked from a converted bedroom at the back of the colonial, my childhood bedroom, which I had moved back into at 23 when my father asked me to help stabilize things after the company's previous bookkeeper retired. That stabilization had lasted 6 years. I paid no rent, which my father mentioned occasionally when he wanted to remind me of the arrangement's terms. I was paid a salary of $38,000 a year, which had not changed since I started. The median salary for a licensed CPA in New Hampshire at the time was $71,000. I knew this because I had looked it up every year and said nothing about it every year. If you've ever been the person in your family who keeps everything running while everyone else takes credit for the warmth, I think you'll understand exactly what I mean when I say that I didn't resent it at first. Resentment takes energy, and for a long time I was too busy to resent anything. The quarterly tax filings alone took 3 weeks of concentrated work. There was always something to stabilize, something to restructure, something to keep from going visibly wrong. I was good at invisible work. I had been trained for it since I was small. The house itself was in my father's name, held inside a family trust he had established in 2008 with an estate attorney named Gerald Foss. The trust named my father as sole trustee. My mother, Celia, was a beneficiary. Pilar and I were listed as remainder beneficiaries, meaning we would inherit equal shares upon both parents' deaths. I had read the trust document twice, once when my father left it on the kitchen table in 2019 and once when I quietly requested a copy from Gerald Foss's office in 2022, telling his paralegal I was doing routine family financial planning. The paralegal sent it without question. I kept the copy in a manila folder in the bottom drawer of my desk, under a hanging file labeled Insurance, Miscellaneous. The engagement happened in March. His name was Daniel Cortez, an architect, kind and steady, the sort of man who remembered which coffee order you'd mentioned once 6 months ago. We had been together for 4 years. He proposed in the kitchen of his apartment in Concord with a ring he'd had made by a jeweler his grandmother had used, and I said yes before he finished the sentence. I told my parents that same evening. My mother hugged me. My father shook Daniel's hand and said he looked forward to getting to know him better. Pilar was at a vendor dinner and texted congrats, with 2 exclamation points that felt like a door closing gently. The wedding was set for September, 6 months out. I began planning it the way I planned everything, carefully with a spreadsheet. The first time Pilar said something I couldn't set aside, it was a Saturday in April, 3 weeks after the engagement. My mother had organized what she called a celebration lunch, her phrase for any meal that required the good dishes and a reason. We were in the dining room. My parents at the heads of the table, Pilar across from me, Daniel beside me. My mother had made arroz con pollo and bought a supermarket cake with congratulations Marisol and Daniel written in blue frosting that had bled slightly at the edges. The conversation moved the way family conversations do, in circles, landing briefly on the wedding date, then on the venue question, then on whether Daniel's family from Hartford would drive or fly. Daniel was describing his mother's preference for driving when Pilar set down her fork and said, without particular emphasis, "You know, I've been thinking about the reception venue, and I really think the Alderman House would be the wrong choice." I hadn't mentioned the Alderman House to Pilar. I had mentioned it to my mother in a phone call the previous week. "I haven't decided on a venue yet," I said. "I know, but I'm just saying, it's a lot of money for a space that's really more suited to corporate events. The lighting is terrible for photos." She picked up her fork again. "Daniel, what do you think?" Daniel said he hadn't seen it. "Exactly," Pilar said, as though that settled something. My father nodded in the way he nodded when Pilar spoke, a slow, considered nod that meant she has a point. My mother refilled my water glass without making eye contact. I squared the papers in front of me. There were no papers, but I pressed my hands flat against the table in the same deliberate way, and said I'd keep it in mind. After lunch, while Daniel and my father were in the living room, Pilar found me in the kitchen wrapping the leftover cake. She stood in the doorway with her arms crossed and said, in a lower register than she'd used at the table, "I just want you to know, I'm going to be very involved in this wedding. For Mom and Dad's sake. They want this to be something the family can be proud of." I looked at her. "It's my wedding, Pilar." "Of course it is," she said. "That's why I'm helping." She said helping the way my father said arrangement, as though the word were doing something other than what it appeared to be doing. That exchange settled into me and stayed there. I didn't mention it to Daniel on the drive home. He was happy, and I didn't want to spend the drive home explaining the particular geometry of my family's condescension, which would have required more context than we had miles. The second incident came 2 weeks later, at a Sunday dinner my father hosted for a property contact, a man named Fletcher who was considering listing 2 rental properties through Vidal Holdings. My father liked to include family at these dinners. It projected stability, he said. I had heard him say this enough times that I had stopped noticing it until I noticed it again. I was at the table when Fletcher asked what everyone did. My father described himself, then described Pilar. She runs the client side, the face of the operation, incredible instincts, and then turned to me and said, "Marisol helps out with the paperwork side of things." Fletcher nodded politely and turned back to Pilar. Paperwork side of things. I had restructured $2.1 million in variable rate debt 9 months earlier. I had filed corporate tax returns for 4 LLCs. I had identified a $14,000 overpayment to a vendor and recovered it. I had kept this company's books clean enough that a regional bank had approved a refinancing application in 6 weeks rather than the standard 12, because there was nothing for the underwriter to question. I reached for my water glass, set it back down without drinking, and said nothing. After Fletcher left, I helped my mother clear the table. My father and Pilar stayed in the living room. I could hear my father saying something about the properties Fletcher had mentioned and Pilar responding, and both of them laughing at something. The dishes were warm under my hands. My mother handed me the leftover serving bowl without speaking, and I wrapped it in plastic wrap, and the evening ended. I drove back to the Colonial, which was also my home, technically, in the way that a room you are permitted to occupy is a home, and sat at my desk for a long time before I opened my laptop. The thing about being the invisible one in a family is that you can usually trace it back to a single, early decision. Not yours, but one that calcified before you were old enough to contest it. In our family, the decision was made when I was 11 and Pilar was 16. My father had taken Pilar to a weekend conference for small business owners in Manchester. She came back with a lanyard and a new vocabulary. Leverage, equity, pipeline, and my father told everyone at dinner that she had asked the keynote speaker a question from the audience, and the speaker had called it the best question of the day. I remember sitting across from her at the table while my parents glowed, and thinking that I would learn to ask good questions too. It took me several more years to understand that the opportunity to ask the question had never been extended to me. By the time I was 19, I had stopped expecting to be taken to the conferences. I took myself to the library instead. I read accounting textbooks with the serious attention of someone who understood that competence would have to substitute for access. I passed the CPA exam when I was 23. I told my parents over dinner. My mother said, "That's wonderful, Mija." My father said, "Now you can actually be useful." He meant it encouragingly. That was the part that took me years to understand. He was not being cruel in that moment by his own measure. He simply had a fixed idea of what I was for. I moved back into the Colonial 6 weeks later when he asked for help with the books. What followed was 6 years of work that I can describe now in the flat, specific way that makes it legible to anyone who has not lived it. I filed the company's federal and state tax returns for 6 consecutive years, covering 4 LLCs and 1 S-Corp, without a single penalty or audit flag. I maintained the accounts payable and receivable for all 83 units, including processing security deposit returns within the statutory window every single time, which kept the company out of 3 potential small claims actions that I identified before they became actions. I renegotiated a vendor contract with a landscaping company in 2021 that had been auto-renewing at a rate 15% above market. The savings over 2 years came to just over $18,000, which went back into operating reserves my father used to cover a roof replacement on a Keene property without having to draw on the credit line. I caught the $14,000 vendor overpayment I had already noted internally, recovered it in full, and logged it in the accounts without telling anyone. My father noticed the accounts looked better at the quarterly review and told Pilar she must be managing vendor relationships more tightly. Pilar said she had been working on it. I did not correct this. In the winter of 2022, when 2 properties in the portfolio were sitting at variable rates that had adjusted upward by nearly 2 full points, I built a refinancing model over 3 weekends. I presented it to my father on a Monday morning with a summary page and the supporting calculations behind it. He looked at the summary page, asked one question about the lender I was recommending, and then told me to proceed. The refinancing closed in 6 weeks. He mentioned it at a family dinner as an example of the company's strong banking relationships. The second incident I remember from that winter. Pilar came into my office, my childhood bedroom, the one with the window that stuck in cold weather, on a Tuesday afternoon in November. She wanted me to pull a payment history for a tenant who was disputing a late fee. I pulled it while she stood in the doorway. She looked at my desk, the dual monitors, the color-coded filing system, the stack of quarterly reports, and said, "I don't know how you stand working in here all day. It's so small." I handed her the payment history. She took it without thanking me and went back to the front of the house. I turned back to my screen. My pulse had done something briefly in my throat, a single tight beat like a cable snapping, and then settled. I noted the tenant's account in the dispute log and moved on to the next file. The pattern across 6 years was consistent enough that I had stopped cataloging its individual instances. My father described the company to outsiders using his own name and Pilar's. My mother participated by declining to interrupt him. Pilar participated by accepting credit without attribution, which is a particular skill. The ability to receive something that is not yours with a composure that looks like entitlement so complete it has forgotten it ever had to be earned. I had been managing the trust documents, too, since 2022. Not officially. Gerald Foss's office remained the attorney of record, but I had become the person who fielded questions from the office, tracked the anniversary review dates, and flagged anything that needed the trustee's signature. My father signed what I put in front of him. He did not always read it first. I knew the trust's terms as well as Gerald Foss did, possibly better, because I had read the document with the specific attention of someone looking for seams. The wedding planning had been going well, by which I mean I had been managing it the way I managed everything. Quietly, systematically, without asking for help I had learned not to expect. Daniel and I had settled on a venue. A restored farmhouse event space in Ware called the Hartwell Farm, which accommodated 120 guests, had good natural light, and cost $6,400 for the full-day rental. I had booked it in May, put down the deposit on my own credit card, and added it to the wedding spreadsheet I kept in a shared folder with Daniel. We had a caterer in conversation, a photographer confirmed, and a florist I had met with twice. The total projected cost sat at $24,000, which Daniel and I were splitting from savings. We had not asked my parents for money. I did not want to owe my father a wedding the way I already owed him a room. In late June, my father called a family dinner. These were not unusual. He called them when he had something to present, and he liked the presentation to include an audience. I drove to the Colonial on a Thursday evening. Pilar was already there when I arrived, sitting at the kitchen island with a glass of wine, and the way she did not look up when I came in told me she already knew what the dinner was about. We sat down. My father waited until my mother had served before he spoke. He said that he had been thinking about the wedding and about the family, and that he wanted to give Pilar a larger role in planning the reception. Not the whole wedding, he was careful to say not the whole wedding, but the reception. He thought it would be good for the family to present itself cohesively. He said the word cohesively and looked at me when he said it, which meant he was saying something he had been rehearsing. I asked what that meant in practical terms. He said Pilar had some ideas about the venue and that he thought the Hartwell farm might not be the right fit. He said it in the tone he used for financial decisions. Measured, reasonable, the tone of a man who had already decided. Pilar, beside him, looked at the table. "I've already put down a deposit," I said. "That can be recovered," he said. "Or we can work around it. The point is the family being well represented." Daniel and I chose that venue together. My father looked at Pilar. Pilar said in a careful voice, "I just think we could do something that feels a little more appropriate for the family's profile, given the business relationships we've built." I set my fork down and said nothing for a moment. The dining room was very quiet. Through the window over my father's shoulder, the oak tree in the front yard was moving slightly in an evening wind I couldn't hear through the glass. "Whose wedding is this?" I asked. My father said, "That's not the question." "I think it is," I said. He set his own fork down then, and the dinner shifted into the register I recognized, the one where he was no longer presenting and had moved to deciding. He said that the Hartwell farm was a fine enough place but not the kind of venue that reflected where the Vidal family stood now. He said that Pilar had looked at several options and that there was a ballroom at a hotel in Concord that held 200 guests and that he was willing to contribute to the difference in cost. I said Daniel and I were not planning a 200-person wedding. He said that was something we could revisit. I drove home that night on the interstate with the radio off. I did not call Daniel until I was parked outside his apartment, and when he answered I told him what had happened with the even, careful voice I used when something had already moved past the point where expressing it would help. He was quiet for a moment and then said, "What do you want to do?" I said I wasn't sure yet. But I had been thinking about the trust document in the bottom drawer of my desk, and about Gerald Foss's office, and about a second conversation I had quietly started. Not with Gerald Foss, but with a different attorney, a woman named Patricia Chen, whose practice focused on trust and estate law, and whose consultation I had scheduled for a Tuesday morning in July without telling anyone in my family. I said I wasn't sure yet. But I was starting to be sure. The meeting with Patricia Chen had taken 40 minutes. I had brought the trust document, 3 years of the company's tax returns, a copy of my employment agreement, such as it was, a 2-page letter my father had written in 2018 that established my salary and my role and had never been updated, and a personal ledger I had been keeping since January, which listed every material financial contribution I had made to the company across 6 years, with dates and dollar amounts and the supporting documentation cross-referenced by folder and file number. Patricia Chen read the trust document first. Then she read the ledger. Then she asked me 3 questions, all of them precise, none of them rhetorical. By the end of the 40 minutes she had explained what I already suspected and several things I had not known to look for. I left her office with a notepad full of her handwriting and an appointment for a follow-up the following week. Over the next 3 weeks I made 2 more visits to her office and several phone calls. I did not tell my father, my mother, or Pilar. I continued filing the company's quarterly reports. I continued managing the accounts. I did not cancel the Hartwell farm booking. The dinner happened on a Saturday evening in mid-August, 5 weeks before the wedding. My father had called it a family planning meeting, which was his phrase for a gathering where the outcome had already been decided, and the meeting was for ratification. Pilar was there, and my mother and Daniel, whom I had asked to come. I had told Daniel the broad shape of what was coming. He had sat with it quietly for 2 days and then said, "Whatever you decide, I'm with you." That was the kind of man he was. We sat at the dining room table, the same table as the April lunch, the same chairs. My father had a legal pad in front of him with some handwritten notes. Pilar had her phone face down beside her plate. My father opened by saying he had made a decision about the reception venue. He said he had spoken to the events coordinator at the Concord Hotel and that the Saturday in September was available, and that he was prepared to contribute $8,000 toward the upgrade, which he described as a wedding gift. He said this in the tone of a man presenting a solution to a problem he had created, which is a specific kind of generosity that functions as control. I let him finish. Then I said, "Before we go further, I want to share something." I reached into the bag I had brought and set a folder on the table. I produced the first document, a copy of the family trust, flagged at 2 specific clauses, and placed it between my father and Pilar so both could see it. "This is the Vidal family trust," I said. "Established 2008. I've read it carefully." My father looked at it and then looked at me. "I know what the trust says." "I know you do," I said. "I want to make sure we're all reading the same document." I placed the second document beside the first, a 1-page summary Patricia Chen had helped me prepare, which identified the trust's asset inventory, the trustee's obligations under New Hampshire trust law, and 2 specific provisions related to the management of trust assets. One of those provisions required the trustee to act in the best interests of all beneficiaries, not only the primary. The second established that compensation paid to family members providing material services to trust-held assets could, under certain conditions, be subject to review for adequacy. Pilar picked up the summary page. She read the first paragraph and set it down. My father said, "Where did you get this?" "I've been working with a trust and estate attorney," I said. "Her name is Patricia Chen. She's reviewed the trust document and the company's financials." The room was quiet in the way rooms get quiet when everyone present understands that something has shifted and no one is yet sure how far. "This is unnecessary," my father said. "I disagree," I said. "I've been managing this company's finances for 6 years. I've been paid $38,000 a year for work that the market rates at closer to $71,000. I've also been living in this house as part of an informal arrangement that has never been formalized in writing." Patricia's review identified a number of things I think we should address. I placed the third document on the table, my personal ledger, printed and bound. 81 pages. This is a record of every material financial contribution I've made to Vidal Property Holdings since 2018. Dates, amounts, outcomes, supporting documentation. My father looked at the ledger and then back at me. "You've been keeping a record." "I have." Pilar said, "Marisol, what are you doing?" "I'm having a conversation we should have had years ago," I said. My father's voice changed register then. It dropped and steadied in the way it did when he had decided something was a challenge rather than a discussion. He said that I had been compensated fairly for what I contributed, that the house was a benefit he had provided out of generosity, and that bringing an outside attorney into family business was an insult to everything he had built. I folded my hands on the table and said, "I'd like to talk about the wedding." He stopped. "You told me at that dinner in June," I said, "that the question of whose wedding this wasn't the question." "I've been thinking about that. And I think it was exactly the question. Because the house we're sitting in right now, the house Pilar wants the reception to reflect well on, I want to talk about what my 6 years of work contributed to its maintenance." The room did not move. Daniel, beside me, was very still. My mother had her hands in her lap. I said, "Patricia has advised me that I have grounds to file for a formal accounting of the trust and a review of compensation adequacy under New Hampshire law. I'm not filing anything tonight. But I want everyone at this table to understand that I am no longer conducting this family's finances without that option on the table." My father said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "You would do that to this family." "I would protect myself in this family," I said. "Those are different things." The silence after that lasted long enough that my mother stood up and went to the kitchen. The sound of the faucet running was the only thing in the house for a moment. Pilar said in a flat voice, "I don't understand why you're doing this now." I looked at her. "I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to hear it." She looked back at me with the expression she used when she was preparing to be patient. "At the April lunch," I said, "you told me you were going to be very involved in my wedding for Mom and Dad's sake. That the family needed to be proud of it." I paused. "I've been thinking about that word, proud. You meant proud of the venue, the head count, the impression it made. But that word, the family being proud, I've heard it my whole life used to mean something that had nothing to do with me." Pilar said, "That's not fair." "In 2018, I continued, Dad introduced me to a business contact and said I helped with the paperwork side of things. The same quarter, I had recovered $14,000 in vendor overpayments and filed 4 corporate returns without a single flag. Paperwork." My father shifted in his chair. "In 2022, I said, "I built the refinancing model that kept 2 properties off a default notice. The closing took 6 weeks. Dad mentioned it at dinner as an example of the company's strong banking relationships. I was sitting at this table when he said it." Pilar said nothing. "In November of that same year, you came into my office to ask me to pull a payment history. You looked at my desk and told me you didn't know how I stood working in such a small room." I let that sit for a moment. I had been in that room for 4 years at that point. I had filed 12 quarterly reports from that room. "I don't think you knew that. I don't think you thought about it." My father said, "Marisol." "I'm almost done," I said. "And 6 weeks ago you sat at this table and told me that the question of whose wedding this is wasn't the question. I want you to know that I understood what you meant. You meant that the family's presentation outweighed my preference. That has always been the operating assumption." I paused. What I was actually doing, while I was being the invisible one in this family's presentation, was keeping this company solvent. Those 2 things were happening at the same time. I just wanted to say that plainly. I picked up the folder, straightened the documents inside it, and set it back in my bag. "I'm keeping the Hartwell farm booking," I said. "Daniel and I are getting married there in September with the people we've invited. If the family would like to be present, we would like that. If the venue doesn't reflect the family's profile well enough, I understand." I stood up. My father did not stand. Pilar looked at the table. My mother had come back to the doorway of the dining room while I was speaking and was standing there with a dish towel in her hands, and when I looked at her she held my gaze for a moment, just a moment, before she looked away. I thanked them for dinner. Daniel stood beside me and we left. In the car he reached across and put his hand over mine on the gear shift. He didn't say anything. Neither did I. We drove back to Concord on the interstate with the windows down and the late August air coming through, and I felt lighter than I had felt in years, which surprised me because I had expected to feel frightened. I was not frightened. I was done. Patricia Chin filed the formal accounting request the following Tuesday. My father called me 3 times that week. I returned the 3rd call, spoke to him for 11 minutes, and told him I was willing to discuss a compensation adjustment and a formal employment agreement before I would consider withdrawing the filing. He said he needed time. I said I understood. Pilar did not call. She sent 1 text, for days after the dinner. I didn't know it was that bad. I read it twice and did not respond. We got married on a Saturday in September at the Hartwell farm in Ware. The light that morning was the kind of September light that comes low and gold through the maples, and the farmhouse had a porch that wrapped around 2 sides of the building, and Daniel's family from Hartford filled half the chairs on the left side of the aisle, and the other half were people who had chosen to be there because they chose us. Friends, a few of Daniel's colleagues, 2 women from my UNH cohort who had driven up from Boston. My parents came. My mother cried at the ceremony, the real kind of crying, and hugged me in the way she sometimes did when no one was specifically watching, fully, without calculation. My father shook Daniel's hand and told him he was a good man. He did not say anything about the venue. Pilar did not come. I thought about her during the reception, briefly, while Daniel was dancing with his mother and I was standing at the edge of the porch with a glass of water, watching the maples. I did not think about her with bitterness, not exactly. I thought about how long a person can stand in a doorway watching someone else work and believe that presence is the same as participation. I had spent 6 years trying to make my work visible enough to be seen and then understood, finally, that visibility had never been the problem. The problem was that being seen required the other person to look. The formal accounting process concluded 4 months after the wedding. My father agreed to a revised employment agreement, a salary adjustment to $67,000, a formal title, and a written acknowledgement of my role in the company's financial management. It was not everything Patricia Chen had identified as recoverable. It was enough to make the arrangement honest, which was what I had wanted. The trust remains in my father's name. I remain a remainder beneficiary. Gerald Foss's office continues to handle the anniversary reviews, and I continue to flag what needs the trustee's signature, because the company still needs someone to do that work, and I am still, at my core, someone who does the work in front of her. What changed was the condition under which I do it. I used to think that patience was a form of loyalty, that staying quiet and keeping things running was a way of showing my family that I was committed to them. What I understand now is that patience without documentation is just hope, and hope alone is not a financial strategy. The moment I wrote down what I had done, with dates and amounts and outcomes, was the moment my own contribution became real to me in a way it had never quite been before. Not because the work had changed, because I had decided to see it. I don't know if there's a lesson in that beyond the obvious one, that the people most likely to be overlooked in a family are often the ones keeping it together, and that keeping it together does not obligate you to keep quiet about it forever. Those two things are not a package deal. If this story made you think about your own family's version of that arrangement, share it with someone who might need to hear it. Someone in your life may be doing the invisible work right now, and they might need to know that the ledger they're keeping in their head, it counts. Write it down. The story you just heard is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes. All names, characters, events, and circumstances are entirely invented. Any resemblance to real persons or actual events is coincidental.